Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and proceed. I'm here to make introductions. I have the honor of introducing I'm Tiffany Galvin Green, the Assistant Provost from the Office for Inclusive Excellence. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Menah Pratt-Clarke. Dr. Pratt-Clarke is the Vice President for Strategic Affairs and the Vice Provost for Inclusion and Diversity at Virginia Polytech Institute and State University, also known as Virginia Tech. She's also Professor of Education in the School of Education in the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences with affiliations in Africana Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Department of Sociology. She has a bachelor's degree from the University of Iowa, a master's degree in literary studies from the University of Iowa, and a master's degree in sociology, a PhD in sociology, and her law degree from Vanderbilt University, which makes her a triple door. She has more than 20 years of administrative, academic, and legal experience in higher education and focuses on executing and coordinating large-scale strategic initiatives that promote institutional change. And prior to joining Virginia Tech, she has held several senior administrative positions and faculty positions at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and here at Vanderbilt University, where she served as the University Compliance Officer, the Assistant Secretary to the University, and University Counsel. So she's very familiar with Vanderbilt and very happy to be back here. Her research interests include critical race studies, black feminism, and critical race feminism, with a particular focus on issues of transdisciplinary analysis of diversity issues. She's published several articles and book chapters and has published 4 books. Her most current work, which is available for purchase outside, and she'll be doing book signing after the keynote today. Her most current book is A Black Woman's Journey from Cotton Picking to College Professor, Lessons About Race, Gender, and Class in America. And I want to note that this book was recently selected as the 2018 American Education Studies Association's Critics' Choice Award for recent scholarship deemed to be outstanding in its field. So we will be hearing more from her, so I will not delay further. Just to note that all of her work, and professional and private, she's very much a champion for speaking to the power of the powerless. And so I'm honored to present to you our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Menah Pratt-Clarke.
Good afternoon. It's an absolute honor and privilege for me to return to Vanderbilt, an institution that deeply influenced and shaped my life, both as a scholar and an administrator. So I want to just thank the planning committee and all my friends and colleagues here. I spent the morning having conversations on campus, and it's been really wonderful. The joint degree program changed my life, showing me connections between and across disciplines and points of intersection around race, class, gender, and the law. It provided me with ways of thinking, but more importantly, tools. The vocabulary, the words, and the language allowed me to channel an anger, a rage, a deep pain, and almost unspeakable trauma caused by the mere existence of being a black woman in America. Vanderbilt gave me the words and the tools, and I'm deeply grateful. As a young child, I only knew one word, and that word was system. I heard that word all my life from my parents. They told me that there was a system that I had to fight. They made me watch Roots, which came out as a TV series when I was a young child. It was an experience that traumatized me for years, searing in my mind and imagination the whippings and beatings, and Cicely Tyson as a black woman fighting for humanity. My parents told me that because of the system, I had to work twice as hard and be twice as good, and even then it would be tough. Because of the system, I had to be fierce, determined, tough, and persistent. As a child, I didn't know why they seemed so intent on socializing me into understanding this strange system that seemed unfair and unjust. I didn't know until I came to Vanderbilt that it was a system that Bell Hooks calls the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. It was here at Vanderbilt that I was introduced to Patricia Hill Collins and Black feminist thought, and I began to understand the system and its relationship to power as a hegemonic force legitimating and perpetuating domination and oppression. It was here at Vanderbilt that I learned about critical race and critical race feminist scholarship. The intellectual classroom experience provided a way to understand and explain my own daily life and the operation of the system in my life, as a lawyer, in my work in higher education, as a faculty member, as a mother, as a daughter, and as a wife. It was the no's, the closed doors, the salary disparities, the you can'ts, and the I won't let yous. It was the stop signs and red lights. It was the micro and macro aggressions in meetings. It was emails of disrespect. It was the advancement of lesser qualified white men and women without searches. It was the exclusion from opportunities and lack of mentoring. It was very different pay and salary despite being the only one in the office at 7 a.m. and the only one staying after 5. It was being the last person to have my hand shaken during introductions. It was having my hand not even shaken at all. It was watching the school system's treatment of my children. It was watching the prison system's operations for members of my family. It was being horrified at the operation of the health care system and long-term care facilities with my parents. It was being confounded by patriarchy and homophobia in places of worship. It was the very painful recognition that we as women of color, as people of color, as Black men and women in America, are in places where we are not meant to be. And when we are in those spaces, we are not welcomed, we are not included, we are not valued, and we are not appreciated. Today, as part of our thinking about Black Lives Matter and MLK, my theme is in spite of it all. What should we do, those of us who care, allies, advocates, activists, and ambassadors? Those of us who care must first learn the history, the words, the language, and the tools to talk about the system. And then we must commit publicly, privately, courageously, relentlessly, persistently, and unyieldingly to dismantling the system in all its manifestations to create the world envisioned by Martin Luther King. This will require an immense level of courage and determination that sometimes I am not sure we have. It is the same courage and fearlessness that led men and women and children during the civil rights movement to march without weapons, facing dogs and guns and water hoses to demonstrate their humanity and to demand the rights associated with being Americans. It was the courage was largely generated by the power of Martin Luther King's words and voice and charismatic leadership. We must not underestimate the power of voice and leadership, especially if we recognize that leadership is the ability to persuade others to actions with words. The system understands the power of voice and so seeks to silence dissenters and to limit freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The hegemonic world in which we live has socialized silence. I think how often women, people of color, advocates, and allies are silent, unable, or unwilling to speak. I have come to truly believe and understand Patricia Williams' reference to the spirit-murdering impact of silence and silencing. Audre Lorde writes about the effects of silencing on the silenced in an essay called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Words have energy and power. Angela Gilmore, a Black woman law professor, said, "There are still some times when I am silent, most often because I am afraid. Sometimes justifiably, sometimes not. Yet usually I do not achieve anything as a result of my silence. Silence does not cause the fear to disappear. Silence does not make me feel more secure. And silence does not dispel ignorance." I believe that we must refuse to be silent and silenced. Fighting against the silence is a means of survival, and also a radical act of courage, because the system polices our thoughts and there are consequences for our words. Jemele Hill, a black woman sports broadcaster, is a prime example. Silenced and sanctioned by ESPN for speaking out about racism in the NFL. Serena Williams, policed for her words, for demanding, as so many of us need and want to say, "Tell me you're sorry." But the world does not apologize for its racism, its sexism, and its oppression. Yet the perilousness of our existence as marginalized people demands that we continue to speak, to voice our concerns, and to become more courageous. This is a courage that I encourage others to have, even as I myself work on stiffening my own backbone. Often when I speak, it is still with apprehension and anxiety, even as a full professor and vice president. A credential which should be and is a shield for so many who are white, both male and female, to say whatever they please whenever they want. Fighting against the silence and fear, I've started recently a blog, posting it on my website and linking to it through Twitter and Facebook. My blog has covered a range of topics on life. It includes reflections about death and dreadlocks, motivated by the national media covered suicides of white men and women, Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, contrasting it with the invisibility of a black boy whose mother asked my beautician to twist the locks of her son in a funeral home. Her son had committed suicide and shot himself in the head. I wrote about art and artists and the power of art to show and portray what often has no words or not enough words. I wrote about the patriarchy embedded in Christianity and the concepts of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, asking why couldn't it be mother, daughter, and the rainbow? Why is this writing so important? We know that the mere act of writing and speaking for marginalized groups, especially women of color, is a social justice act. That's the power of the Me Too movement, women speaking up. Yet we must realize the difference in power from white privileged women of wealth who can speak and say Me Too, and the absence of a platform for women of color to say Me Too. For when Anita Hill simply said me, not Me Too, just me, no one listened, no one stood by her or validated her. No ministers, no persons of the cloth, no sororities, no civil rights organizations, no women's organizations. The world allowed her, as a black woman, in the most powerful forum in the world, an all-white male Senate, to stand alone. We often still stand alone silently. Black women often not only stand alone, they die alone too. Although much of America knows the names of black men killed by police, very few know the names of black women and black transgender women killed, harassed, and arrested across the United States, like Sandra, Charlena, Shantae, and Dejanay. And so we have hashtag Say Her Name, a hashtag, a movement demanding speech, a calling out, a recognition of black women, that black women's lives matter. Because so often when we speak of Black Lives Matter, we think only of black men and boys. My dissertation here, called Where Are the Black Girls?, documented the exclusion of black females from the social and legal discourse on single-sex schools for black males in Detroit. That dissertation, finished in 1997, almost 20 years ago, is indicative of the exclusion that continues in the context of debates about race, even within the black community. And so we need movements. Movements are like earthquakes, shifting tectonic plates, shifts that create change. Social movements move people and motivate normally agnostic, ambivalent, apathetic masses to action for a moral cause. Movements are about our morals and values as a nation and as a people. And ultimately, America must be held accountable. Our words and our voice and actions create accountability for ourselves, for others, for America, and for the world. Accountability provides a context for my thinking about our theme, from MLK to BLM, 50 years of struggle. I want to show a short video to help us think about accountability. It should be where it is. Yeah.
The Negro Mother by Langston Hughes. Children, I come back today to tell you a story of a long, dark way that I had to climb, that I had to know, in order that the race might live and grow. Look at my face, dark as the night, yet shining like the sun with love's true light. I am the dark girl who crossed the Red Sea, bringing in my body the seed of the free. I'm the woman who worked in the field, bringing the cotton and corn to yield. I am the one who labored as a slave, beaten and mistreated for the work that I gave. Children sold away from me, husbands sold too. No safety, no love, no respect was I due. 300 years in the deepest South, but God put a song and a prayer in my mouth. God put a dream like steel in my soul. Now through my children, I'm reaching the goal. Now through my children, young and free, I realize the blessings denied to me. I couldn't read them, I couldn't write. I had nothing back there in the night. Sometimes the valley was filled with tears, but I kept trudging on through the lonely years. Sometimes the road was hot with the sun, but I had to keep on till my work was done. I had to keep on, no stopping for me. I was the seed of the coming free. I nourished a dream that nothing could smother. Deep in my breast, the Negro mother. I had only hope then, but now through you dark ones today, my dreams must come true. All you dark children in the world out there, remember my sweat, my pain, my despair. Remember my years heavy with sorrow, and make of those years a torch for tomorrow. Make of my past a road to the light, out of the darkness, the ignorance, the night. Lift high my banner out of the dust. Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it and splinters and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I've been climbing on and reaching landings and turning corners and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So boy, don't you turn back. Don't you sit down on the steps because you find it kind of hard. Don't you fall now. For I'm still going, honey, I still climbing. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair.
So who is this woman who has symbolically come back to us here today to tell us the story of the long, dark way that she, as a black woman and mother, had to know and grow and suffer? Who is this woman who tells us to keep climbing even though we find it kind of hard? Telling us to remember her pain and to make of her path a road to the light? Who is this woman at the age of 80 battling Alzheimer's with the determination to speak, mandated that she be recorded reciting these poems by Langston Hughes written in 1922 and 1931 so that the DVD could be played at her funeral? Who is this woman seeking to hold us accountable? This woman is my mother, Mildred Pratt. She spent the last decades of her life writing her own story of her journey of picking cotton to becoming a full professor of social work. She wrote by hand on notepads, hotel room memo pads, yellow legal pads, journals, whatever she could find when she had a memory or story she thought was important. When she was dying, she told me to finish it, and I spent the last 5 years transcribing her handwritten notes to form a cohesive story of a journey of a young black girl born on the cusp of the Great Depression in 1928 in rural East Texas, one of 8 children, picking cotton, working as a maid, living in utter poverty, raised by a single mother. A young girl whose father was often in jail, who moved, like many sharecroppers, from house to house in shelters that could barely be called a home. A young girl who somehow found a dream like MLK to hold on to. A dream that there was something more, something better, something different. Her story, told in a black woman's journey from cotton picking to college professor, is not one of 50 years, but of almost 100 years, from the early 1900s to the early 2000s. Her journey took her through every major city in America: Kansas City, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Detroit, and Pittsburgh. From the South to the Midwest to the East Coast to the West Coast, trying to make a way out of nowhere. Her life as a poor black girl had been systematically structured and orchestrated for her to have no way out. She knew that her life was extraordinary, that she should remain part of the masses of uneducated, poor sharecropping children. She knew that a black woman whose grandmother was a slave didn't rise up in the 1940s and 1950s and go to college, because in 1940, 90% of African Americans lived in poverty. She knew that as a black girl who was a class valedictorian of a segregated high school, but also dark and poor, didn't get to go to college because in the 1950s, only 2.4% of black women had completed 4 more years of college. She knew that as a young black girl at the age of 11 who was raped by her brother, that she would often not survive with her mind intact, with enough sanity and perseverance to keep on keeping on. She knew that a black woman, even with a bachelor and master's degree in religion in the 1950s, couldn't be a minister, couldn't share the word of God because of her gender, even though God herself didn't discriminate. She knew that black women weren't supposed to get admitted to the PhD programs in the 1960s and become full professors in the 1970s, when black women represented less than 1% of full professors. She knew that a woman who had to use an outhouse was never supposed to get to the White House and meet presidents of the United States, including a black president. She knew that in a world of legalized segregation and discrimination, doors were never supposed to be open for her. She knew that it would be important for her to try to capture the story of her life. No one was going to do it for her. No famous journalist would seek her out. Without speaking for herself, she would remain a hidden figure. She knew that she had to document her often invisible fight for our place, our right to be, our right to exist, to be valued, and to be heard. She knew she had to represent the invisible Negro mother who, with courage, conviction, and confidence, navigates America with grace and class and power that never gets seen or acknowledged. More importantly, she knew that as a professor, she could ensure that other African Americans could also be seen and acknowledged. In founding the Bloomington Normal Black History Project, she shared the lives and journeys of almost 100 elderly African Americans whose stories had been buried and silenced. She shared their stories so that they and their lives wouldn't be forgotten, discarded, or thrown away. So why? Why did Mildred want to share her journey and the journey of other African Americans? In her own words, she says, "I have protested the treatment of African Americans and females since I was a child. I could go on and on with examples of my protest on behalf of African Americans and the shaft that many black women get. Many of us paved the way for so many who now reap the benefits of our protest. Many black females protested to open the doors for the current generation. We must remember, as Colin Powell said, that we rode on the backs of those who went before us, and we have a responsibility to be the backs for those who come after us." So Mildred Pratt has symbolically come back today to be the back for those of us who come after her, those of us here today. And although her journey has many lessons for us, the lesson I want to share today is about the importance of voice, of speaking up, of calling a thing what it is, of denouncing, of pronouncing, of proclaiming, of naming, of challenging. All of our lives are defined by key moments, moments of decision, moments of opportunity, moments of transformation, moments of courage, and moments when we have a window of grace to make a difference in our own lives and the lives of others, if we but believe in ourselves and if we speak up and lift up our voice. Mildred's life was full of defining moments when she had to rise up to speak up, often alone, often as just me. As a little girl at the age of 8, she remembers going to the mailbox to get the mail, and the postman said, "Hey, boy." And she said, he knew she was not a boy. She was a girl in a dress with braids. But in the 1940s, just outside of the Depression in rural segregated East Texas and across the South, blacks were not seen as humans and girls were invisible. Yet she found her voice and she proudly proclaimed, "I am not a boy, I'm a girl." She ran home and told her mother, who told her never to do that again. Because in the segregated South, speaking to whites could lead to death. As a young child, she didn't understand why, but her entire life would be spent challenging protocols, procedures, practices, policies, and politics. In high school, in her senior year, the senior class sponsor decided that a boy, not a girl, should be class president, even though the valedictorian, which was Mildred, was always class president. Mildred chose to question her, and though the outcome didn't change, it was a stance and a statement. We must make stances and statements even when the outcome might not change. As an assistant professor going up for tenure in 1972, 45 years ago, Mildred wrote a letter to the president of the university, chastising him and calling out the racism of the institution in her tenure case. And this is what she said in her letter. "I have found myself, since early April, caught up in an entanglement regarding my department's recommendation that I be appointed to the position of associate professor. As I have been struggling through the maze of what you describe as inefficiency, my intellectual struggle to understand led me to conceptualize the situation as institutional racism." Now, Mr. President, I'm not a lawyer, but like most black people in this sea of white, I have had to learn with my fellow brothers and sisters that life in America is a constant diet of struggle for justice. Being competent is not a passport in this white sea, but is a symbol for stand back further. Because a competent black threatens the secure feeling of the racist in his myth that all blacks are inferior. In simple language, I have been compelled to assert that it is impossible for a black to get justice in this ISU community. I have then decided that the appointment process in this university community is filled with deliberately built-in stumbling blocks. Let me provide a brief summary of the many inconsistencies which I have encountered. Since you have the final decision-making responsibility here on campus, I am placing the facts in your hands. I refuse to be insulted by a system which is obviously, quote, inefficient. So what was Mildred saying? She was saying, enough, I'm calling you out, I'm calling out racism, I'm calling out the system, I'm naming it, I'm standing on high moral ground. There was no movement for Mildred, no masses of people, no EEO office ready to help her. There was just her. There was not a Me Too, she was just me. Mildred's experience with the president 40 years ago was defining. She spoke up. I know from the Women of Color in the Academy National Conference that I started 6 years ago, that brings together almost 500 women of color, that so many women of color in the Academy are still having the same experience as Mildred. But very few have the courage to say me and us and we. So, has much changed in the 50 years since King's assassination? The themes in Mildred's letter: institutional racism, the struggle for justice, stereotypes of black inferiority, deliberately built-in stumbling blocks, they reflect the disparity that exists between black America and white America. A few statistics tell a powerful story. In education, 42% of black children compared to 6% of white children are educated in high poverty schools. Nearly half of the nation's African American students attend high school with dropout rates between 40 and 50%, and fewer than half of the black students enroll in college graduate within 6 years. In the environment, 78% of black Americans compared with 50% of white Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. In sports, although African Americans make up 67% of the players in the NFL, they receive 92% of the unsportsmanlike conduct penalties, a statistic that sociologists believe may be linked to a negative reaction to cockiness or self-promotion when demonstrated by a black player. We see the condemnation that black athletes received by taking a knee, though we know that we have taken knees for most of our lives. And in Serena Williams, we see the policing of black women's conduct in sport from dress to speech. In health, in Serena, we also see the challenges in the healthcare system, with disproportionate rates of black women dying in childbirth. And black mothers are more than twice as likely as white mothers to experience the death of a baby within the first 28 days of the infant's life. In politics, 25% of elderly African American voters, compared to 8% of elderly whites, do not possess the identification that would be required under the new photo ID laws introduced in 40 states before the 2012 election. So this is just a handful of statistics, and so on one hand, not much has changed. On the other hand, much has changed, and I think it's easy to forget how much has changed. So I often remind myself of the progress that has been made not over the last 50 years, but over the last 400 years. I want to share the one experience that has been a defining experience for me at Virginia Tech. It was my visit to the Smithsonian African American Museum last spring, organized by the director, Kimberly Williams, of the Black Cultural Center. And we know that cultural centers on college campuses reflect the struggle of people saying me, saying us, saying we. The trip to the Smithsonian with 100 African American students was about us saying us and we matter. Our lives matter. The trip placed me in a place and space that allowed me to reflect on what we have overcome as Africans displaced in America. I started my visit at the bottom of the museum. As I listened to the woman operating the elevator describe that we would be descending 400 feet to represent 400 years from the initial beginning of slavery in America, my mind went to Sierra Leone, the country in West Africa founded by free slaves, to Freetown, the city where my father was born, and to Bunce Island, where there still remains the prison and the cells where African men, women, and children were held before boarding the ships. I remember my visit to Bunce in the spirit of the ancestors as I ride the elevator down. I step off the elevator into another world, Africa, Egypt, and the pyramids. I remember touching the Great Pyramid, built over a 20-year period by 100,000 people as an act of worship, using 2 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, and some blocks weighing as much as 16 tons. African people built the pyramids. Our backs built the pyramids. In Egypt, I went into the tombs. I touched the paintings and hieroglyphics with my own fingers. I put my toes in the Nile River. I felt the power of a people that could build, create, paint 4,000 years ago what we can barely conceive of today. I thought of their power and potential. My mind shifted back as the images in the museum quickly moved from African kings and queens to the Middle Passage, the boats, the captors, the world of white racism. I felt the racism in the museum, the hate, the clan, the anger. I felt sorrow and pain. In the museum, I walk, I look, I read, I'm overwhelmed. I slowly climb the ramp to the next level. I want to believe it's a ramp of hope and possibility and potential. I realize that the ramps have twists and turns like our lives in America. Slavery, the Civil War, freedom, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, a constant battle for validation. I spend time looking at Emmett Till's casket. I hear Mahalia Jackson singing, and I cry. I remember my mother sharing that she heard Mammy Till, Emmett Till's mother, speak in Los Angeles after her son's murder. And she remembers teaching her social work students about the murder and their refusal to believe her until she showed them the Jet magazine's image of Emmett Till's body. I read about King's assassination, Malcolm X's assassination. I see Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ida B. Wells. I spent a long time looking at a video about Angola Prison. The name, again, takes me back to Africa, and I learned that Angola State Prison in Louisiana was named after the homeland of its former slaves. Its origins go to 1880, where inmates were housed in the old slave quarters and worked on the plantation. 6,300 men are warehoused in Angola, nearly 80% of whom are African American. As I weep for them, I know that few of us acknowledge that black women and Latinas are the fastest growing prison population in America. And 60% of women in jails across the country are women of color. And I remember the men and women I taught for years in the prison system here in Nashville. Amazing students, talented, gifted, brilliant, and behind bars. discarded humanity, discarded people, thrown away. My mind goes back to the museum. I read about education and Mary McLeod Bethune, and I remember the images, many of them of young girls walking to newly desegregated schools to get a better education in the midst of white hatred. I spent time thinking about history and about how more of us should know and teach others our history, that it is a history of power, of survival, of struggle, of potential realized, of obstacles overcome, in spite of it all. There's no other population on earth that has experienced what African Americans have in terms of the history of slavery and its mammoth brutality, disrespect, and degradation. Yet, we are still here, in spite of it all. As slaves arriving on the coast, we had to make a way out of nowhere, and like the ramp that continued to rise from the bowels of the slave ships to the top floor of the museum, to the achievements of African Americans in music, arts, education, health, medicine, sports, and politics, I am reminded that we are still here. We have met the challenges and we will meet them again. We'll meet them because of our core identities as Africans. As Africans, we have survived in places and positions and institutions that were not designed for us. As Africans enslaved in America, we had to learn a new language, form new families, adapt to new cultures, and worship new gods. We had to be creative and innovative. We had to work exceptionally hard to thrive in the midst of hatred, in the midst of unequal education, in the midst of economic injustice, in the midst of political injustice, in the midst of police brutality, in the midst of circumstances and situations designed to completely eliminate and decimate and demoralize an entire population. As Africans in America, we survived in spite of it all. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, uses an analogy to talk about surviving in the midst of almost inconceivable obstacles. She refers to a tough little plant that managed, without water, sunlight, nutrients, to send out a brave and ornery little leaf anyway, in spite of it all. So in spite of it all, we are still here. In spite of slavery, in spite of humanity, in spite of racism, in spite of the system. 50 years after MLK, we are still here challenging America, holding America accountable, standing on high moral ground, and sending out brave and ornery leaders, advocates, allies, and activists, and being the back for others, and lifting others as we ourselves climb. As I close, I want to share the advice from two women of color presidents whose journeys I share in a book I co-edited last year called Journeys of Social Justice, examining the journeys of women of color presidents. The first quote is from Rusty Barcelo, a lifelong advocate for equality and social justice. And she reminds us, she says, struggle hurts. And yet, it is also a catalyst for connection and liberation and social justice. As I have said so many times, it is by embracing the struggle that we do transformative work. So yes, struggle does hurt, but we cannot do transformative work to transform society without struggle. And to do transformative work, it requires a certain mindset. And Waded Cruzado, who's the president of Montana State University, provides a final word of advice for us on the mindset we need to do the transformative work. Again, pulling from Estes, she says, if you have ever been called defiant, incorrigible, forward, cunning, insurgent, unruly, assertive, rebellious, you are on the right track. If you have never been called these things, there is yet time. So time is not yet up for us to speak. It's not yet up for us to advocate. It's not yet up for us to challenge power. It's not yet up for us to be defiant, cunning, insurgent, unruly, assertive, and rebellious. Our time is not yet up. Thank you. So I was told to share that there's time for Q&A questions if you'd like to ask me questions, and there's two mics in the middle of the back room if you have any questions or comments or feedback or thoughts you'd like to share.
This isn't a question, but I've been texting with one of your former dissertation committee members, Karen Campbell, and she says, "You are amazing," and we could not agree more.
Well, thank you for that.
As an alum of Virginia Tech, I have I understand some of the dynamics that exist in that space. Are there any lessons that you've learned, or that in being in the role that you're in, that we could learn from here?
Sure. You know, I share with everybody, this work of diversity and inclusion, especially on predominantly white campuses, is difficult, complicated work. And all the institutions who care are trying to figure it out. And I have seen certain qualities that make a difference, certain factors that make a difference in the success of an institution to move a diversity agenda. I mean, the first one is the unyielding commitment, genuine, authentic commitment of the leadership. So from President Sands at Virginia Tech has had a phenomenal commitment, and I share with everyone, when I started at Virginia Tech, I started with a secretary and an associate director. And now I have a team of almost 18. It's a really amazing, incredible team. We've been able to advance diversity, I would say, exceedingly rapidly, but that's because there was a strong group of faculty, staff, and students who, before I arrived, for a period of over 20 years, have been advocating. But they needed a catalyst. They needed someone to come and say, we're going to move on these. So before I started, they asked me to do a talk at their annual diversity conference. And in getting ready for that conference, I read 1,000 pages of 20 years of reports. So I knew before I went sort of the landscape and the goodwill and the movement, the primingness of the institution for the work. And so we didn't need reports. I said, I don't need reports. Let's just do the work. But to do the work, you need resources. You need money. So it's not just an institutional commitment, sort of the tone at the top by the presidents. There's an amazing leadership of deans and vice presidents and vice provosts, and we are aligned as an institution now. But you also need resources. The work costs money. You can't do it without money, and it's a lot of money. You know, but people readily put money into a whole lot of things. We want to advance our research agenda, here's money. We want to advance education for undergraduates, here's money. We want to find graduate students, here's, I mean, they put money into a lot of things. So it's like, if you want to advance diversity, it needs money. In addition to resources, the other piece I have found, there's a skill set to do this work. Nobody readily says, let's talk about being black in America. Nobody gets excited about that. Nobody gets excited about having a diversity conversation. And so if you want to move a diversity agenda, you have to have a certain skill set. So what I have found, not just at Virginia Tech, but in many places, there's goodwill. There's a tremendous amount of goodwill at Virginia Tech. I mean, we have a motto. Our motto is ut prosum, that I may serve. So that already is a great start, because we're sort of primed to think about service and caring about humanity. And then we have these principles of community that sort of set forth our expectation. But the principles were born out of a struggle of African American faculty and staff and community saying, this is not good enough. Let's set a framework for the culture that we want to have. Okay, so we have this great motto, we have these principles of community, and we have a lot of goodwill. People at Virginia Tech are extraordinarily kind. But you still need to know. You need the words. That's what I talked about. You need the words to do the work. And I think as a country, over a long period, we've created a silence. Don't talk about that. We don't talk about history. We don't teach the history. We don't give young boys and girls, students in middle school, high school, college, the words to talk about identity. And, you know, one sort of problematic piece, I have 2 children who just finished college. And I remember just trying to understand their educational experience. It's like, I don't have time to homeschool you. I hope the school does like what it needs to do for you. And, you know, coming and it's like, what did you do for, you know, Martin Luther King Day or Black, you know, we have these sort of signature things where in school a young person should know something. And, you know, one day someone, you know, was talking to another student and said, what's Milk Day? Like, they didn't know what MLK stood for. They called it milk. What's Milk Day? And so I really feel like if we're going to shift the culture and the ability of our nation to talk honestly and authentically about issues of identity, because it's not just race, it's not just gender, it's sexual orientation, it's religion, it's politics. There are these identities of who we profoundly define ourselves, that we need to be able to honestly tell another person this is how we define ourselves. But we haven't created those words, we haven't created the skill set. And so I feel that for an institution cannot move a diversity initiative if it doesn't have the words. And if it doesn't have people who know how to use the words and what to say and how to facilitate honest, authentic conversation. So that's been, you need the leadership, you need the commitment, you need some set of core values, shared values, you need resources, and you need tools. You need the words. Hi.
Hi. I've enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
My name is Gwendolyn Reese, and I work for the Vanderbilt HVTN. I wondered, when you mentioned Anita Hill, do you have any things you would like to say about the parallels or the differences in the way these women are being treated? And I'm just talking about the way they're being treated, and no really judgment or anything.
You mean in the current political environment?
Yeah. Uh-oh.
I'm trying to get my words right. I think what has happened in America is that this issue of the treatment of women in particular is gaining space. So society is now being forced to confront issues that have persisted since the world was begun, of how women are treated. But women now this is the Me Too movement. Women can come forward and say, this happened to me. But women have been coming forward and saying, this happened to me, and nobody did anything. I mean, that still happens today, right? On college campuses, women come forward and say, this happened, and nothing happens. Okay, and people in every department know the bullies. They know the people who are racist, the people who are perpetuating sexist behavior, and nothing happens because they're tenured faculty members, or we need to follow this policy or procedure, and at the end of the day, they're still here. And we all know who they are at every institution. So the challenge becomes, who and when are people courageous enough to do, who have power to do something once they know? Okay, so I think the opportunity becomes, and I tell everyone, there are consequences for speaking out. There are honest, legitimate, authentic risks for speaking out against oppression. And I think that's why allies and advocates are so important, because it shifts some of the burden of the risk to those who have the capacity to bear it, so that the vulnerable, marginalized, disenfranchised individual is not bearing the entire brunt of standing up for and against oppression. So I don't know what this current political dynamic, how it will play out. I mean, I think we're in a space and place and time in America where there are a lot of systems. The system is even more prevalent in how it's manifesting itself in America. And whether there are enough voices, I'm intrigued, sort of as a scholar, about the movement that happened, sort of the pink hats that happened after the current president was elected. But where are the pink hats now? Seems like they could or should be mobilizing in very strong and powerful ways. And so I just feel like as a society, we have to begin to critically challenge, what's happening, and to be willing to ask the question and challenge who has the power, I go back to often thinking about what Vanderbilt gave me, this ability to understand how to talk about stuff. And I remember, I would say often in sociology classes, I sat there silently. I felt like I was one of a few black students. It was hard to, and there was a class on lynching, that it was a methods class on lynching, which is very interesting. looking at the steps involved that led up to a lynching. Okay. And whether there were parallels between XYZ lynching and Y lynching, I was like, I can't just come to class every day and sort of relive the lynchings. But this issue of how to talk about difficult things that America experienced, and how do you socialize different communities, and to have people listen to an experience of rape. And I share the example that my mother was raped by her brother, and her sister saw the rape. Okay, so in the book, my mom told me she was raped when she was dying in the hospital. And she said, Menah, I'm going to tell you something you need to put in the book. And then she told me she was raped by her brother. Then her sister, the only living sister, said, Menah, I saw that. I said, you saw what happened to Mom? She said, yes. She said, the brother said, go home, and I didn't understand why I had to go home, and Mom, Mildred could stay put, so I stayed put. Right? Just a little mindset of a child. She said, I didn't tell our mother because I didn't have the words. I would have if I had the words. So the question is, do we have the words as a nation, as a society? And when we have the words, do we use the words to create the action, the change that we need? I mean, for me, I think that's the question. And those who have power, do people use their power when they can to make change? I do think presumably powerless people have more power than they think. So a few years ago, black students across America were protesting. And they were protesting the same things that happened to my mom 40, 50 years ago. But as black students rose up, they issued demands. And the demands were not inconsequential. I mean, they were like significant at some of these institutions. And from private to public to, large to small, I mean, all across America, black students were making demands. Who has the power to change that? Shifts started. But the persistence of the responsibility that we place on black students to navigate institutional change is unacceptable. They should be studying and attending lectures like everybody else. Instead, they're having to plot strategies to get administration to pay attention. And I feel like we have to begin to really have these conversations about, how can we just honestly talk about whatever the thing is, create strategies for change, and then implement them.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Mariam Abel-Fazli. You might have spoken about this a bit in your speech. I came in midway, so I apologize. But on the same wave of having the conversations and the difficult conversations. So a moment in America for someone like me right now is that there is a voice that's very powerful right now that is basically saying, why do we still need affirmative action? Why that woman, it's not that we're talking about whether she was, whether there's evidence for her rape, but that she's crazy and hysterical and this is a political move. These voices are very powerful right now. They've always been around, obviously, they're dominant, but right now they've kind of gotten a platform. You can say what you will. I'm wondering, I've seen myself in conversations with people that support a lot of those beliefs. And either they support it because they tell me who they voted for, or they support it because they're expressing it. But a lot of times it's by their vote. So we don't have a conversation yet. And I'm wondering if let's say you're at Virginia Tech, and this probably has happened to you, I'm sure, but you don't have to say so. And you're sitting across the table from someone that has a very distinct worldview that in some ways basically oversteps on your personhood. Right, whether if you, it's come down to everything here, right? But, and I'm being a little vague, I'm sorry, I'm being a little politically correct here, but I think everyone knows what I mean. Let's say the Me Too movement, they don't believe in it, for instance. Let's say Black Lives Matter, they don't believe in it. These types of things, and it goes affirmative action, why do we have it? I don't have a job, why does that person have a job? Immigration, all that stuff. And you're a brown woman that has immigrant parents that, or whatever it might be. What have you done in those moments? The reason I'm asking specifically is that I've found that I have been quiet, probably because I don't have the words, but also because there's a power dynamic currently in the current country Those people were, in a weird way, those people were voted in, or it feels that way, right? So they have power, and so and I can see myself cower a little bit to that. And then the next thing that I've noticed, and I'm just speaking personally, is that when I start to speak about an issue that matters to me, let's say pro-choice versus pro-life type of thing, I feel that there's, how do I say it? I'm speaking about it like it's a foregone conclusion. You're there and I'm here, and if I bring it up, you're going to know that about me, and that's going to create distance between us, and I need this bridge to continue to be there because, for whatever reason, you know, I might work with you or whatnot. So it's a really, I find this incredibly challenging right now. And then if I do speak, so here's the third thing that happens. Let's say I speak truth, it's gone. The relationship is gone. They know who I am now. I'm on the other side, and the bridge is broken. How to do this?
How to do this? How to live in America? So I once saw a bumper sticker that said, "Speak your mind even if your voice shakes." So I go back to that reminder often, that it is as much fear and apprehension as we may have. The importance of speaking up remains paramount. Understanding their consequences. And so I'm not saying speak out without an awareness of the consequence. Okay. But I think often the consequence is not as bad as we imagine it to be. I guess the other piece I would say, I think I'm uniquely positioned in many ways. So trained as a lawyer, I know how to navigate certain questions to ask. And the ability to engage in sort of dialogue and debate that doesn't fracture, but creates the opportunity for sort of mediation. So it doesn't have to be polarization. Because the polarization, there's always points of connection with someone who on particular identity spectrums are different. But there's always a point of commonality. But you can't find that point of commonality without the conversation. And it can't be that the conversation stops once I say, I believe this, and you say, I believe that. So how do we allow, even if for temporary conversation, okay, fine, you can believe that, and I'm going to believe this. But let's talk a little bit more just to understand how you got to that position, how you reached that value or belief or core, something that became core to you. And then the ability to not become defensive or create a defensiveness, but to create that space to authentically hear a story. So once because if people say, I'm this or I'm that, and then that conversation ends, the story, you never hear the story. But there's always a story that's led up to that positionality, that identity, that belief. The stories, if nothing else, it doesn't mean that you're gonna stop believing X, but you might gain more compassion and empathy for why they reached Z position. Okay, so then the friendship doesn't end. It's like, okay, we know you're here, I'm here, but I've shared my story too, so hopefully they will have some compassion, some empathy. So then you find your shared humanity. And I think this context of what is humanity and what connects us ultimately become stories about things we all kind of agree on. The importance of family, the importance of love, the importance of community. I mean, there's just core values to what make us human and what promotes our sort of goodwill-ish in life. And those stories create that. And so I think being able to, again, it is a tool, right? So it's not that the conversation says, I'm X and you're Y and it's done. It's like, let's have the time and space. And I remember at different institutions in different ways, it's like, how do you build community? Because then the community allows you to have conversations. In the absence of community, you can't have. Okay. So the community creates those spaces for conversation. So do you create, just a work area that people can come together and just be in. And then over time, people will start talking. And then you see the same person and you start talking and you say, okay, just because I'm X political view doesn't mean I can't be friends with someone who's Y. Because ultimately, we share the same connected thing here that we learned about because of the story. So I think the stories are important in creating that space for a fearless. I do think you have to be fearless. Fearless, authentic conversation. But if we bring into the space our fears and then we don't talk or we silence or we feel silence, then the conversation ends. But I think it takes a certain level of courage and fearlessness to say, I'm going to tell my story, but I'm willing also, because the fearlessness has to also go to listening. So you might be hearing things that you don't like. I think black people are this or that, or I think gay people, or my religion, doesn't allow me to support X. And then it gives an opportunity to have the conversation, to understand how are you thinking about religion in this way. So I don't think the goal is to move to another, spectrum. It's to understand. And I think to have a level of empathy, sympathy, compassion, to ultimately value that person's humanity as extends beyond that one identity. Because none of us are just one identity. We're all multiple. We have certain salient identities. I'm a this, and this is core, but we're all many. And I think the more spaces we create for the many identities as opposed to the one core or the one or two more salient identities, the more opportunity we have to build a broader community. Hi.
Hi. So when we're talking about the Me Too movement, and black women in relation to the Me Too movement, we're dealing with a segment of the population that, because of institutional issues, is looked down upon and basically shut up. And also important when thinking about this is when we look at federal statistics, the rate of men getting raped when we consider prison rapes is actually higher than that of women getting raped. And yet, this doesn't seem to be an issue because prisoners are even more considered of an underclass. What is the role of those who want to appropriate the Me Too movement? I'm speaking particularly of male prisoners. And how do they have a role in appropriating the Me Too movement? And if so, how can they do it?
Appropriating. That's an interesting word. I don't know if male inmates need to appropriate the Me Too movement. But I think that, and remember, one of the statistics I talked about was that you also have a growing number of women also in prison who also would be, and who also are subject to rape, often by male, not exclusively, but guards, as well as women in prison. So the issue of rape in prison is a valid conversation. I don't know if anyone has to appropriate a seeming movement by another group, but I think that opportunity to form coalitions and to sort of create a larger set of understanding about the breadth of issues of sexual abuse and sexual assault. I think that forum is there. And maybe Me Too provides an initial, space to say, Me Too as a man. I mean, and you have men who are not in prison who are also raped, right? So it's not, the prison setting is unique because it's a further marginalized, disenfranchised population. But in society, men and women are raped. And so it becomes a conversation about rape writ large. But I do think that we have to understand the differential power associated with different identities. So not that men can't appropriate Me Too, but I think we also have to understand that there are racial and there are gender dynamics in America. Okay, so you wouldn't want men appropriating Me Too. Men can say Me Too without appropriating. But the issue, I think we have to be mindful that men and women have different experiences and there are different power dynamics based on gender. Okay, and an appropriation by men, even inmates of Me Too, could have the effect of silencing and creating a larger voice that then minimizes and excludes women who are also still trying to say Me Too. So I think it's a very complicated dynamic, but I think the importance of raising issues that relate broadly to humanity or inhumanity in society are equally important.
I think we want to give enough time for book signing, so we thank you, Dr. Pratt-Clarke.